To discuss that further, we're joined by our correspondent Amina Taylor and Mr. Rodney Shakespeare, Professor of Economics, both from London. Let's begin with our correspondent. Amina, if you could give us the latest updates regarding this race for the Tory leadership.
Well, as you mentioned there, the dark horse, and I have to be very careful in the context in which that comes across, because we're talking here about the final five. We have the lead contenders. Obviously, there are some among us who would think that Rishi Sunak's departure from the job as Chancellor of the Exchequer was one of the real reasons that domino effect began with ministers jumping ship when they saw that the man who had perhaps quietly backed him, or at least not publicly slated him, had decided enough was enough. Penny Mordaunt, she's still in the race. Liz Truss, the former foreign secretary, well, she will be looking for the top job or hoping to remain in that post. Tom Tugendhat, and of course, the lady you mentioned there, Kemi Badenoch. And of all the candidates, it's perhaps surprising that she is still in the position where she's made it through two subsequent rounds when big hitters like Sajid Javid, Jeremy Hunt, and so on have all fallen by the wayside. Now, one of the reasons for this, they're saying, is she's untouched by the scandal and some of that nastiness surrounding the Johnson premiership, and that she has fresh one nation Conservative Party ideas. But there is also the thinking that she might be a little malleable because she's on the right of the Conservatives. And there would be figures in the background who may not want to put themselves forward, but would see her as a perfect vessel for some of their more hard right Tory policies, where they double down on austerity, they double down on lower taxes, they will double down on some of this anti-woke agenda. So she ticks a lot of boxes. She's the Minister for Equalities, or she was until she resigned last week. But the jury's out with Kemi Badenoch. It really is. I think as a black woman in this country, a Kemi Badenoch premiership would do nothing for people of color here. But that's another story for another day.
Okay, so let's bring in Mr. Shakespeare. If you could please shed more light on the different challenges that the new Tory leadership will be facing. There are a lot of issues right now on the table. Most importantly, probably, is the cost of living crisis.
Well, early on, you actually referred to the climate crisis. And I'd like to start with that and say that they have no policy and no intent and no way in their minds of solving the climate crisis. Here's a fact, that the richest 1% of the world cause double the carbon dioxide emissions of the poorest 50%. And on top of that, the richest 1% are rapidly increasing in number and wealth. In the last 2 years, their wealth has increased as much as in the previous 23 years. In other words, 10 times, speeding up 10 times faster. Now, unless you know that and you understand that, you realize that nothing coming out of those candidates that Amina was referring to, none of them have any solution to world matters. There are other aspects to do with the fact that half the world's population live on under $5 a day, and the significance and that 10,000 people die from dirty water. It's all integrated, but there's nothing coming from the Conservatives on that side of things. As for the cost of living, they have simply shot. It's worse than shooting themselves in the foot. They are creating the collapse of the European societies. That is what is going on. Their policy on sanctions on Iran is completely and utterly failure, complete bankrupt. And it's all gone the opposite way with what they intended. They don't intend changing. So as far as I'm concerned, kick out all these candidates on the Conservative Party. And for that matter, I don't think there's anything much better in the other parties either. Either on inflation and certainly not on understanding the big issues as regards climate.
Okay, so Amina, we just heard what Mr. Shakespeare said, and that is pretty much in line with the next question I was going to ask you. Do you see actually any difference in policies from these candidates that are now up for the leadership of the Tory leadership?
Well, let's start a little bit with the climate policies that you mentioned earlier that precipitated this conversation. I mean, when it comes to just slamming the net zero idea, Kemi Badenoch was the only one who said she considers this unilateral economic disarmament, which, is a fancy way of saying she thinks it's bad for the economy. Liz Truss is another kind of one nation Tory. She has said that there will be a moratorium, a pause on some of the green levies for these taxes. It stands in line with her other economic policies, which is we don't really know what she stands for. We don't really know what she would think about some of the serious issues. I mean, when it comes to being a minister, even though she has one of the top jobs of state, she's considered a lightweight. I mean, there is no photo exhibition or opportunity that the foreign minister seems to miss. Any kind of comparisons with Margaret Thatcher are always welcomed in her corner. Penny Mordaunt, well, she's talked about trying to make things better for working people. And a lot of them are talking about this cost of living crisis and addressing the cost of living crisis and trying to do what they can for those who are in the most danger. Well, guys, you've been in power for 12 years. If you wanted to sort out the cost of living crisis, perhaps you should have had a word when your colleagues were busy causing it. So even Rishi Sunak, who has taken some of the responsibility as the man who set out the fiscal path since 2019, 2020, it's very difficult to see how he can separate any new ideas from some of the burden and responsibilities had at costing some of this. I mean, he tried to ride the wave of COVID a little bit here by reminding us that he was the man who did the furlough scheme and, he put money back in pockets when many were suffering. But he's also the guy who's clamping down and acted really, really slowly when it came to the very worst of the cost of living crisis. So they all have very large question marks on how they would do anything solid for the people. I think those who are already skeptical about Conservative Party politicians will see this lot as just more of the same, and it's a root and branch change that's needed. Kind of moving the deck chairs on the Titanic isn't going to solve this.
Okay, we're running out of time, and it seems that Mr. Shakespeare wants to comment on that. So if you could wrap this up in about 2 minutes.
Well, very quickly, there's the cost of living. And there's two things you can smash it down. Cut the price of oil. That means you deal with Iran and you deal with Venezuela. As for gas, Nord Stream 1 is shut. Nord Stream 2 is shut. You open those two pipelines and you're immediately going to, I don't know, half or more the cost of gas. And gas and oil go into the price of everything. And in the case of gas, it can destroy the whole of, for example, the German industrial economy. Those are two very clear things. They're not talking about that. They just let the price goes up and they don't care if the people suffer because they are playing a game which has nothing to do with the interests of the British people. They're playing a game in which they're trying to elevate Russia and then get on and do China. Nothing to do with the interests of the British people. So there I gave it to you. Gas pipelines, open them. Oil from Venezuela and oil from Iran. They'll make a hell of a difference to the price rise.
Thank you very much, Rodney Shakespeare, Professor of Economics, and our very own Amina Taylor, both from London. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and views with us on this edition of the News Review. And thanks to all of our viewers for following this edition.